Hi, and welcome to this fourth session of the Three Course, where we are exploring the three key dimensions of the Christian faith relating to the Creator God as Father, making sense of who Jesus Christ is, and experiencing the dynamic power of the Holy Spirit. And in the last three sessions, we have explored various aspects of God's character and being, particularly that God is life and light and love. But we now turn from the Creator God to try and figure out who Jesus Christ was and is. And to get to first base in understanding Jesus, there are a further three things that we need to explore, namely Jesus' life, death, and his resurrection. So in this session, we'll consider the first of those, Jesus' life. So what is it that makes the Christian faith distinctive amongst all of the other world religions and philosophies? The simple and short answer is Jesus Christ. Let me read to you a quote from New Testament professor Tom Wright, who says, "Christianity is not a new moral teaching, as though we were morally clueless and in need of some fresh or clearer moral guidelines. Christianity is not about Jesus offering a wonderful example, as though our principal need was to see a life of utter devotion to God so that we could try to copy it. Rather," he says, "Christianity is about something that happened through Jesus of Nazareth." Amongst the world's religions, this makes Christianity uniquely historical. For better or worse, the Christian faith is grounded in the person of Jesus, who lived at a particular time and in a particular place. By any measure, the impact of that life is really quite mind-boggling. Consider for a moment this well-known reflective statement, which is usually attributed to James Allan Francis and entitled "One Solitary Life." So Francis writes this. He says, "He was born in an obscure village, the child of a peasant woman. He grew up in another village where he worked in a carpenter shop until he was 30. Then for 3 years he was an itinerant preacher. He never wrote a book. He never held an office. He never had a family or owned a home. He didn't go to college. He never visited a big city. In fact, he never traveled more than 200 miles from where he was born. He did none of the things that usually accompany greatness. He had no credentials but himself. He was only 33 when the tide of public opinion turned against him. His friends ran away. One of them denied him. He was turned over to his enemies and went through the mockery of a trial. He was nailed to a cross between two thieves. While he was dying, his executioners gambled for his garments, the only property that he had on earth. When he was dead, he was laid in a borrowed grave through the pity of a friend." 19 centuries have come and gone, and today he is unquestionably one of the central figures of the human race. And then Francis writes this. He says, "All the armies that ever marched, all the navies that ever sailed, all the parliaments that ever sat, all the kings that ever reigned, put together, have not affected the life of people on this earth as much as that one solitary life." That one solitary life. So being an historical figure, Jesus opens himself, his person, his teaching, his actions, to scrutiny in a way that virtually no other philosophy or religion does. So let's consider some introductory thoughts about Jesus' life. Many people think of Jesus as some sort of mythical figure who never actually existed. But I think it's fair to say that no serious historian today would assert such a thing, because in historical terms, the life of Jesus of Nazareth is remarkably well attested to. There are 7 historical references to Jesus in the writings of ancient Greek and Roman historians who were contemporaries to the birth of the Christian church. There are a further 2 Jewish sources that give details about Jesus' life as well. Now, none of these 9 historical sources were written by followers of Jesus. And these historians, taken together, provide a remarkable list of details about Jesus that aligns very closely with the New Testament accounts that we have of Jesus, which were obviously written by his followers, those New Testament accounts. So what sort of documents are there in the New Testament? There are 4 basic biographies of Jesus, which we call the Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And they're normally dated between AD 50 to 90. That's the period of time in which they were written. But those Gospels are based on earlier informal documents from which teachings and stories about Jesus were drawn. So we can say that the teaching of Jesus was written down very early by the people who knew him best. Also in the New Testament, there are what we call epistles, which are letters written to early Christian churches. These contain incidental reference to many details about Jesus and his life, and are dated between about AD 40 to 70. So, using the recognized historical textual principle of multiple attestation from independent sources, we can say with great confidence that the Gospels themselves are a remarkable set of historical documents. But let me explain that a little bit further. The late Professor F.F. Bruce, Professor of Biblical Exegesis and Criticism at Manchester University, has compared the New Testament documents with other well-accepted historical documents using commonly recognized historical criteria. Now, 2 such criteria include the period of time between when the text was originally written and the dating of the earliest surviving copy of that text. See, in ancient times, texts were written on parchment or animal hide, which would deteriorate relatively quickly, so the text would be copied again and again as earlier copies faded or were destroyed so that the text could be preserved. Obviously, the closer to the event that the existing copies can be dated, the more confidence we can have in their accuracy. A second criteria is simply the number of ancient copies available that we can use to compare with one another to identify small textual errors or discrepancies that inevitably occurred in the handwritten copying of ancient documents. And this is a process called textual criticism. And the more copies that we have to compare, the more confident we can be in the reliability of the text. So let's just think about a couple of examples. Herodotus was a Greek historian who lived and wrote Greek history in the 5th century BC, before Christ. He lived between, I think it was 488 and 428 BC. Now, there are 8 partial or complete copies of his works in existence. But the earliest of those copies, still in existence, was made around 900 AD. Now that's a gap of 1300 years between when Herodotus originally wrote the text and our earliest surviving copy. Similar figures exist for other historical documents, such as the writings of Tacitus, or Caesar's Gallic War, or Livy's Roman history. For any of those documents, the largest number of copies that we have is 20 copies, and the shortest gap between the original writing of the document and our earliest surviving copy is 900 years. In contrast, when we come to the New Testament, we have not 20 copies, but 23,000 partial or complete copies. The earliest complete copy dates to just 200 years after its original writing, with fragments dating to as early as 60 years after writing. So summing all of this up, Professor Bruce says, and I quote him, "The evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. And if the New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt." So the New Testament documents are this remarkable account of Jesus' life. What is it that we find, though, when we read that account? John Dickson shares an interesting experience that he had on Talkback Radio. Callers were invited to ring in and to share what they thought about Jesus. To Dickson's surprise, every caller spoke of Jesus in favourable terms. but they only referred to a very narrow selection of Jesus' words. The callers loved, for example, Jesus' critique of religious authority, or his demand for pacifism, or his emphasis on love. None of the participants mentioned Jesus' healings or exorcisms, his claims to be the Messiah or the Son of God. There was nothing about his death on the cross or his resurrection. People, Dixon concluded, seemed to have the impression that Jesus was just a charming and courteous teacher only. Dixon's experience suggests a lot of people probably form an impression of Jesus without ever exploring the primary source documents of his life, which are the Gospels. But even if we do access those, it's still very easy for us to read selectively. So let me ambitiously offer some broad snapshots of the content of Jesus' life, considering both his actions and his words, both of which, it's claimed in the Gospels, were simultaneously carried on at two levels, a natural level and a supernatural level. So at a natural level, Jesus' words and actions portray a character that was uniquely attractive and extremely difficult to pigeonhole. Even those who struggle with the Christian faith and with the Christian church find it easy to cast Jesus in a positive light and difficult to cast him in a negative light. The comedian Billy Connolly, I think, spoke for many when he said, "I can't possibly believe in Christianity, but I think Jesus was a wonderful man." And there is a sense in which you would say that Jesus lived a truly beautiful life. Now, if you know nothing about him, I would really encourage you to maybe even stop the video and have a look at one of the Gospels. Mark's Gospel is the shortest and might be a good place to start, but take some time to read through that. Reading his life, it's hard not to notice various aspects of his character and behaviour. His unflinching commitment to tell the truth, his tireless advocacy for the poor and oppressed and downtrodden, his confidence speaking to rulers on the one hand, but also the ease with which he sincerely engaged society's outcasts, his deep compassion, the simple profundity of his teaching, which often left people just scratching their heads and going, wow, where did this come from? We've never heard anything like this before. His profound humility, his refusal to tolerate corruption and injustice, and the way that children loved his company. Nicky Gumbel, who's the creator of the Alpha Course, says of Jesus, "Here was someone who exemplified supreme unselfishness but never self-pity, humility but not weakness, joy but never at another's expense, kindness but not indulgence. He was a person in whom even his enemies could find no fault, and where friends who knew him well said he was without sin." The biblical scholar Walter Wink said, "If Jesus had never lived, we would never have been able to invent him. Such is the uniqueness of his life." But there was something more than all of this, because at a supernatural level, Jesus' words and actions are in significant contrast to the claims of other famous historical figures. Without arguing whether Jesus performed miracles or not, I think we would have to agree that if you read the Gospels, his immediate followers certainly believed that he performed miracles, and his enemies, both within and beyond the New Testament, are recorded trying to explain away his miraculous actions. Something unusual and unexpected was clearly happening through Jesus during the course of his life. Contrary to popular opinion, Jesus didn't live in a day and age of widespread miracle working, where every coincidence is explained as a miracle. In fact, if we search ancient Jewish writings for 200 years before Jesus and then 200 years after Jesus, there are only two other historical figures whom it was believed performed a miracle, and there's only one miracle attributed to each of those. In contrast to that, in the Gospels, there are 38 occasions of miraculous activity attributed to Jesus, and on a number of those occasions he performed many miracles at any given time. But utterly unique is the claim that Jesus performed miracles by his own power. Now, this is completely unheard of in the ancient world. He was not acting in the name of some other greater deity, but rather in his own name. Similarly, his teaching was unique simply because it centered on himself. And in the midst of his teaching and actions, people around him very quickly came to the conclusion that Jesus was claiming to be God. He forgave sins in his own name. Only God could forgive sins. He bestowed life in his own name. He brought the dead back to life in his own name. He taught the truth in his own name. He claimed that he one day would judge the world and sit on a throne in heavenly glory. All actions attributed to the divine being. At various times and across all four Gospels, Jesus made statements that implied that to know him, to see him, to believe in him, to receive him was to know, see, believe in, and receive God himself. He even went one step further, using the Old Testament name for God to describe himself. When Thomas saw Jesus after the resurrection, he exclaimed publicly what the disciples, it took them a little while, but they'd finally figured out about Jesus' identity as he said, "My Lord and my God." C.S. Lewis has quite famously said, and I quote him, "A man who was merely a man and said the sorts of things that Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be insane or evil if deliberately misleading people. You must make a choice. Either Jesus was and is the Son of God, or else he was insane or evil. But let us not come up with any patronizing nonsense about his only being a great human teacher, because he has not left that option open to us." So again, leaving aside the question whether or not Jesus actually was God, I think we could agree that his followers believed that he was. And, something that's often overlooked, the claim of divinity was the primary reason why he was crucified by the Jewish authorities. He had blasphemously, in their minds, made divine claims for himself. But just say Jesus was God. What would be the consequences of that? This claim to be God raised all sorts of questions and issues for Jesus' immediate followers. Having lived with Jesus for 3 years, it was blatantly obvious to them that Jesus was a real human being, but somehow also more than just a human being. They saw his humanity every day. He got tired. He needed to sleep. He was often hungry. He displayed normal human emotions, anger, sadness, love, great joy at times. He was tempted. He learned things. He worked. He struggled with his family's expectations. But he also said and did extraordinary things, the most significant of which was coming back to life after his execution, which we will explore further in a subsequent session. His followers concluded that Jesus wasn't a mythical figure of a god somehow appearing in human form, but rather Jesus was somehow and uniquely both fully human and fully divine. The word our theologians have coined to describe this is Jesus was incarnate. His birth was an incarnation. And that's a big word that simply means to be enfleshed. Jesus was, or rather God was, enfleshed in the person of Jesus. The Apostle Paul, who was one of Jesus' first followers, one of his first followers to write about him, described the incarnation with these words. In Colossians 1:15, he says, "In him the whole fullness of the deity dwells in bodily form." In John's Gospel, at the beginning of the Gospel, it says, "In the beginning was the Word," and that's describing Jesus. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and that Word became flesh and dwelt among us." The poet Gerald Manley Hopkins tries to grasp this very challenging idea with the simple phrase, "God's infinity dwindled to infancy." Charles Wesley expressed the idea in the line of one of his well-known hymns, "Our God contracted to a span, incomprehensibly made man. God became a human being, but not in such a way as to cease being God. He didn't turn into a human being, but rather took humanity up into himself in the person of Jesus. In his book entitled The Jesus I Never Knew, Philip Yancey tells this lovely story about caring for fish in a fish tank to highlight the significance of the incarnation. He describes the great care that he takes with food and water chemicals and light exposure to create the very best conditions for his pet fish. He says, in the light of all of the effort that I expend on their behalf, you would think that my fish would at least be grateful. But no, every time I'm passing near their tank, even if my shadow crosses it, the fish dive for cover. Despite faithfully providing food for them 3 times a day, the fish always respond as though I'm surely going to be torturing them. And Yancey says, and I just quote this, he says, "To my fish, you see, I was a deity. I was too large for them. My actions too incomprehensible. My acts of mercy they saw as cruelty. My attempts at healing they viewed as destruction. To change their perception, I began to see would require a form of incarnation. I would have to become a fish and speak to them in a language that they could understand." See, the incarnation uniquely shows us what God is like. I mean, how do you relate to an invisible, all-knowing, all-powerful, everywhere present God? How could you possibly discover what that God is really like in terms that make sense to us within the limitations of time and space in which we dwell? I want to suggest that the incarnation, then, is this incredible statement of divine intention. God wants you to know him, to see how he works, how he thinks, how he feels. So let me just finish this session with a true story, which is set in an orphanage run by a church. It's Christmas Eve, a party's being thrown for all the children. They sit down at the table with a sense of quivering excitement and expectation. The meal before them is, a feast beyond their wildest dreams. All of the children are there except for one little girl who recently had lost her parents tragically and come to the orphanage just a few weeks previously. She was totally overwhelmed by the experience and by her new surroundings. She was nowhere to be seen. Now, the minister of the church that ran the orphanage, who incidentally was finishing and struggling to finish his Christmas sermon, this is Christmas Eve, he was sent to look for her, muttering under his breath about better things that he had to do with his time. But he went up to the children's bedroom. He had a quick look around. There was nobody there. And he was about to leave when he heard a sound coming from under one of the beds. So he lifted up the bedspread, and sure enough, there she was, the little girl, not crying, not distressed, but just looking at him with, cold, vacant eyes. "Come on, sweetheart," he said. "Time to go. They're having a party downstairs." No response. "Oh, you don't want to miss out on the turkey or the games? I think there are presents for everyone." But there's not even a flicker of recognition on her face. He looks at his watch, he scratches his head, and half-heartedly offers up a quick prayer where he says, "Jesus, what on earth do I do here? How do I help this girl?" And then it hit him. He got up, he went around the room and picked up 6 soft toys. He then took off his coat, he rolled up his sleeves, and he climbed down under the bed amidst the dust and the rubbish, and he started playing with the dollies and the toys. Before long, he had this wonderful game of make-believe, which simply couldn't help but draw the little girl in. It only took about 5 minutes of solid play when her little voice whispered, "Can we go downstairs now?" She had her dinner, and he had his Christmas sermon, because that's exactly what God has done in Jesus Christ. He found us wallowing in the dirt and the mess of our lives, and he didn't command us to, get our act together or pull our socks up. Rather, God took off his coat, he rolled up his sleeves, and in the person of Jesus, he climbed down under the bed to be with us, so that we might also want to be with him, enjoying the fullness of life that he offers to us. So if you've ever wondered if God cares about you at all, if God is at all interested in you, then the confident answer to that question is yes. Because in Jesus, God has taken the first step to connect, to let you get to know him. The very fact, I guess, that you're watching this material or doing this course suggests that maybe you're interested in taking steps toward God as well. Deuteronomy 4:29 says, "If you seek the Lord your God, you will find him if you seek him with all your heart." As you seek him, know, be confident, be assured that he wants to be found by you. Getting to know Jesus, exploring his life, that's a great place to start. So that concludes this first topic of the second session of the 3 course, beginning to think about Jesus' life. Oh my goodness, there's so much more to explore that than I've been able to cover here. And so if you would like to think a little bit more or explore a little bit more, you might like to engage with the questions that will shortly appear on the screen.